Maria, hi, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm all right, thanks, Andy. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you very much. We're starting our films by asking contributors to introduce themselves and give us an overview of their work. So would you mind doing that, please?
Sure. So I'm Maria Shmygol, and I'm a research associate at the School of English at the University of Leeds, where I'm working on preparing old spelling texts of the plays and poems of John Marston, who was a dramatist and poet in 17th century London. And I'm working with Martin Butler and Jose Perez Diaz on this project as we try to prepare the complete works for publication with Oxford University Press. And before I joined Leeds, I was based at Geneva for 3 years, working with Lucas Earn on the Early Modern German Shakespeare project, where Lucas, myself, the other postdoctoral research assistant, Florence Hazrat, and another one of our editors slash research partners, Karine Seidler, prepared 4 translations and editions of early modern German plays, which I'll be discussing with Andy in today's episode.
Great, thank you. Lots for us to unpack there. And you yourself work as well on players, actors, working across Europe, and I believe Northern Europe, is that right?
Yeah, so before I joined the Early Modern German Shakespeare project, this really wasn't my field at all. So my background is in early modern English drama, specifically Jacobean plays, and I've also got a background in textual editing of early modern drama, which is why Lucas brought me on board with the project. And we were thinking about
On my
specifically
phone, sorry. Keep going.
specifically thinking about early modern German adaptations. So there is a lot of work being done by lots of different academics publishing both in English and in other European languages about traveling players across the continent. There's lots of work being done on France and Spain, on the Netherlands, and of course on Germany, where the traveling English players found a really sort of warm welcome for the most part. And a really kind of beneficent business opportunity for themselves as well, because Germany didn't really have the kind of theatrical tradition that early modern England did at the time. So when they traveled to the continent, when they traveled to Germany, they were really bringing something new that people were very interested in, even if they didn't at first understand the language of the plays, which were performed in English to a German audience. So we're trying to sort of reverse that kind of lack of comprehension. So we have German audiences who didn't understand the English language of the plays as they were performed. But now we're trying to have a think about the early modern German Shakespeare texts that come down to us in German that Anglophone scholars sometimes aren't able to engage with because they don't have German, or it's not accessible because some of these plays either haven't been published in English ever, or they're not really accessible in sort of appropriate scholarly editions that scholars expect to use. And so that's what the project under Lucas Earn's leadership was trying to address. There's a gap as far as scholarship is concerned on these plays, and the editions that we've created will hopefully encourage more people to study them, perform them, and sort of think about them comparatively alongside their English counterparts.
Thank you. Some really complex themes already developing here around you have quite a unique skill set, I think, Maria, of moving between editing, performance, international, I guess our colleagues would say transnational work, thinking about plays moving across national boundaries, and working through translation as well. So there's an awful lot happening there. I guess the starting point maybe for talking about this work is that it will be news to lots of listeners that the theatre of Shakespeare's time was an international, or at least a Northern European phenomenon. You talked about Germany not having a comparable theatrical tradition. Do you have a sense then of what a German audience is watching when they watch an English play? Are they having to work through a language barrier? Are they therefore looking at things rather than listening to things in a particular way? Are they looking at something and thinking this is Englishness? What do you have a sense of what English playing means when it comes into a German context?
Mm-hmm. Also, the obvious thing to bear in mind would be that the performance is in English because the English players didn't speak German to begin with. And that meant that the plays that they performed, they weren't just translations. They couldn't possibly be sort of word for word translations because that wasn't possible. So what do you do then? If you're trying to charge people to come and see a show, you have to kind of deliver something for them to engage with. So yeah, they were obviously very interested in bigging up the kind of physical action and physical spectacle of the plays. So a lot of the early translations that come down to us, it's evident that the plot has been streamlined, the action has been kind of cut back to make the play more easier to understand. There's more emphasis on visual and physical representations of information rather than verbal ones. So, for example, in the German Hamlet, Der bestrafte Brudermord, they get rid of almost all of the soliloquies that Hamlet has because, you know, nice as they are in the English plays, in the different quartos of Hamlet that exist, is they're not as necessary for a German audience in the first instance because they're privileging visual information and physical action. And actually, a lot of the references to the Englische Komödianten, or the English comedians as they were known, they comment on their ability to act. So there's lots of references to agieren, like the action of performing, which relates to dramatic performance, but also to other forms of acting like juggling, dancing, acrobatics, there's lots of music as well. And so, yeah, like there's a privileging of physical spectacle. And what you were saying about, you know, whether the audiences would understand this as Englishness is quite an interesting question because there's I forget where the reference is from, but there's a clarification from a German writer who says that, you know, not all Englishmen are actors. Like, this is what we see, this is what we encounter, these traveling Englishmen who sort of dance and juggle and perform these plays, but that's not all Englishmen. So I think they became synonymous in the German imagination at the time with acting, with these kind of fun spectacles. And, you know, you'd think that the language barrier would be an issue, but there's, again, lots of contemporary evidence from letters and written records and reports of performances where people were quite happy to come and watch the action, even if they didn't quite understand all of the verbal sort of happenings of the play.
Yeah, thank you. I'd pay good money to watch Hamlet without soliloquies. That sounds good to me. I mean, I'm someone who spent a bit of time thinking about the emergence of the London playhouses, and I'm now working on the baiting arenas, the animal baiting arenas. And one of the striking things about both of those architectural spaces is that some of our key witnesses are foreigners coming to London and going, "Oh my God, what on earth is that building?" And I wonder if this is, you know, your work is also cluing us to the fact that there is something distinctive and odd going on with English playmaking. And I love the idea that not all Englishmen are actors, says one German to another, because that's the only way that they encounter the English. I'm aware that you've worked across Northern Europe. So is that true of other places and countries that would be watching the English, or for example, in spaces, I don't know, like France or Spain, would there be a different relationship with English drama?
I'm not sure, since I was focusing very much in the German context.
Right.
I think that the earliest sort of beginnings of the English comedians, you know, they sort of came through the Netherlands and Northern Europe. But there are a lot of other sort of exchanges with Spain and France, I guess in Italy as well. But wrong scholar to ask about that.
Well, I mean, I'm wondering then if we're looking at cultural exchange within communities which are at least tolerant of Protestants, if they might not describe themselves as Protestant. Is there something too happening here around religious identity, do you think?
I think so. But it's a difficult question to answer to because there's variations between the Netherlands and even parts of Germany too. Some places are more welcoming to the comedians than others. So we have lots of evidence of petitions being rejected too. So you want on what grounds were they rejected? Did they feel like this is too much of a frivolous thing to allow, our good citizens to watch in our town or village or whatever? But I think there's, rather than a religious, more of a cultural interest. Lots of noblemen and aristocrats, they're interested in having these players because, it's fun, it's spectacular, it draws a crowd, it's a great diversion. And so there's records, for example, of a bunch of English actors being quite well received by the Landgrave of Kassel, who had them perform in his household, but then eventually also built them a small theatre to perform in as well. So they receive quite warm welcomes from noblemen who take them under their patronage and give them support. But then it's also an itinerant lifestyle. You're wandering around and you're not quite sure where you'll be performing next, whether you'll be accepted or rejected by the town authorities. It's a very diverse kind of landscape across Germany and the Netherlands.
Yeah, thank you. And again, for listeners who are new to this, I guess we should say that English companies are at least used to being on tour within England and are also used to being paid to go away rather than to perform plays. So in some ways, this might feel like an extension of a wider kind of touring principle, which is built into how English playing works. But I think you're cluing us in there to how German playing seems to happen under the umbrella of patronage of some kind. You were talking about noblemen and aristocrats. So are these performances generally, are they produced, put on, paid for by local dignitaries? And do we have a sense of who might be watching the plays?
So again, it varies widely. There's lots of different records where it's noblemen sort of paying for all of the performances from their own sort of household expenditure. But then there's also groups of players who perform for the public. So that's why they have to get permission from the city to perform for the public, and then they charge money, and it's a nice little business venture. Turn up and get permission, perform the plays, collect the money, everyone's happy.
Great, thank you. I feel like there are lessons for the contemporary theatre scene at the moment as everyone tries to figure out how to make theatre work, and we still think of it as something which happens in pre-designed buildings, in theatres themselves, and it's useful to be reminded of you can take shows out anywhere, right? Wherever the public are, wherever people are.
It's a really good point, actually, because when the English actors arrived, it's not the same as London, where you've got the purpose-built playhouses. They did find themselves acting in all kinds of different spaces. And of course, as your work has shown, that London was also teeming with different performance spaces that were not purpose-built theatres as well. So they roamed around, they performed in castles, in courtyards of various inns or sort of courthouses. They performed in tennis courts. It's a really kind of diverse landscape of performance.
Yeah.
And the performance conditions change a lot, but that shouldn't mean that the complexity of performance falls away. They did have costumes, which they lugged around. They did have sort of spectacular bits and bobs that they'd kind of wow the audiences with. So it's not just kind of a pathetic little troop of people with a little bindle of walking around the countryside. They did bring the flavour of the London stage with them through costumes and other material properties.
I love that idea of performing in, a fluid range of different kinds of spaces, but bringing in a sense of the London Playhouse with you. And I love the idea of performing from a tennis court. You were talking earlier about the German word for actor being capable of encompassing lots of different kinds of performance modes. And I guess that is true of the English word too. We just don't use it in that way, but it could technically mean anyone who does any kind of action. The word in the period we're discussing in English tends to be player, I think, rather than actor. And again, it's possible to find accounts of players who are actually playing tennis. It's a kind of multi-purpose word. So I love the way you're cluing us into the different spaces and the different kinds of performance.
Yeah, and a very hybrid kind of means of performance too. That when you read the audience, I think there was a lot of improvisation. If you realize something's not quite going your way, you can sort of introduce other sort of diversions on the stage and sort of roll with it. And I should also point out that in the process of trying to make the English plays performable for a German audience, all kinds of additions and cuts had to be made. But they also introduced figures such as pickle herring, which is a kind of clown figure that recurs in lots of these different plays. And the pickle herring figure has kind of several functions. Comedy, so there's lots of slapstick and sort of dirty jokes and all the rest of it. But he also performed the important function of mediating the performance for the German audience, kind of reiterating the action, kind of reiterating what they should be taking away from the action that's just happened on the stage. And so the function of the pickle herring character was often taken on by the principal, or the leader of the acting company. So that figure also was quite important in sort of mediating the actions of the rest of the performance on the stage, but also himself acting. So in the plays that we worked on for the German Shakespeare project, there's lots of instances of really interesting sort of detailed stage directions that we got very excited about. But sometimes you get these stage directions where it just says like, pickle herring acts. Great, what does that mean? But obviously it's kind of giving a textual indication of the something that was happening in the performance, which was important, but it was definitely not verbal,
Was it definitely not verbal? I can see that it doesn't have to be verbal, but could it also be verbal but not tied down by a text?
Yeah.
So it could be improvised. Is that right?
Yeah, so definitely my kind of slip.
No, I think that's fantastic. I really love that. So just to make sure I've understood, pickle herring kind of functions as a comedic figure, a kind of chorus, confirming and repeating the narrative, but maybe also interpreting the narrative.
Sort of helping the audience along.
And I love the combination of the power dynamic that gives that character, and at the same time they're being played by the leading member of the company. I think there's really interesting kind of overlaps between kind of dramaturgical stage power and actual political power within the running life of the theatre company. That's fascinating.
So it's like you're managing the company, but you're also managing the performance on a kind of performance by performance basis.
Yeah. That's great.
He's a great character, but he also pops up in lots of tragedies as well. So we'd expect to find him in comedies, but he's also there in the tragedies. There's a pickle herring character in Romeo and Juliet that performs quite an important function too.
Fantastic, thank you. And you're moving us now towards the Early Modern German Shakespeare project, and I want to embrace that transition. Thanks for making it. But before we leave behind, I mean, obviously everything we're talking about dovetails anyway, but before we leave behind this subject of travelling players in Northern Europe more generally, can I ask you, do we know when this touring tradition starts? When do we have a sense of when the English start touring in Northern Europe, and do we have a sense of whether that tells us something about English culture or something changing with German or Northern European culture? Does that question make sense?
Yeah. So I think the earliest records for English travelling players are from the 1580s. In 1585, there were travelling players. The Earl of Leicester's man joined him in the Netherlands, and then they went on to perform in Elsinore as well. So yeah, from the 1580s onwards, you get more and more of a presence. And I think that comes about for various reasons. I think maybe more to do with the English than with the Germans. Because the English actors, if there's closure of the theatres on account of plague and you're out of work, then, you might go touring on the continent, especially if you've already heard that, there's a market for that kind of thing. And there was, and it becoming more and more of a market too. So by the 1590s, by the early 1600s, there's more and more exchange. And it's a case of actors coming to the continent, kind of touring, performing, going back and forth, sort of these kind of movements. And I'm sure that, if you're an actor traveling in the Netherlands, in Germany, performing these English plays, I'm sure you bring those experiences with you back to England too, and it influences the way of thinking about their profession too. And I should also add that, to begin with, yes, it's English actors, the English comedians performing the English plays, but then they also start kind of mixing with Germans who also join their ranks, and they start kind of creating these hybrid performances and also the English actors themselves, they start learning German too, and that's where the early German Shakespeare texts come from. So the texts that we have, yeah.
That's completely fascinating. And we're definitely going to make that transition, I promise. The last thing I wanted to ask then about this emergence in the 1580s. I mean, particularly if one of our first examples is Leicester's men joining him in benevolence, that sounds to me like that ties this emergence of English playing into Northern Europe quite closely to religious war. And Leicester has been sent over to benevolence by Elizabeth I, and he's been told, whatever you do, do not let them. I'm going to get this wrong here, Maria. You'll need to help me, but he's not allowed to be voted to be their leader, and I can't think what the terminology is. And of course, he immediately accepts. Oh, are you going to do it? Okay, fine. I'll have it. I'll take it. And so I'm wondering if the Leicester's men coming out to join him is a way of demonstrating his kind of courtly, his patronage power. In other words, I don't know if there's any value in that at all, but that feels to me like a very striking time for the English to be imported, as it were.
I think I have to think further about that because I haven't really considered that element of it. But I think it's definitely a case of showing the skill, the power of patronage, that you can support these kinds of arts and you can bring them with you and use them to sort of impress all the different important people that you meet on the continent too. It's a demonstration of English skill and power.
Yeah.
And to show them what England has that they perhaps don't yet.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it was almost an act of war in a way, or part of an act of war. There's a potential pun there, I guess, with the word act, but let's not make it. But I mean, Philip Sidney is out there. There are all kinds of interesting confluences between battles happening across the Netherlands and whatever the English are up to, both politically and culturally. Yeah, that's really rich and fascinating. The last thing I'll say, again, just for the benefit of listeners on this topic, is that people might be wondering why we're getting so excited about English culture being celebrated or attended to across Northern Europe, because of course in later centuries the English and the British project their cultural power very aggressively across the world. So it might be easy to take that for granted, but we're dealing here with a historical period where England is a pretty minor player when it comes to European and international politics, and in some ways where maybe this is an early witnessing of an increase in cultural power and visibility. I don't know if that's right.
Yes and no. I think to begin with, it's definitely this kind of influx of something really exciting and new and something that German audiences are interested in seeing, but also kind of budding German actors are also interested in replicating. And so that they take over that tradition, I think, pretty quickly. So you still get English actors coming over in the 1620s, but then because of the 30 Years' War, performances die down a bit. And then after that, in the 1650s, I mean, there's lots of different German troops who still call themselves the English comedians, even though they're not actually English, but they're performing that sort of tradition of the English plays that were once brought over and then adapted and readapted and restaged. And there's also the term the Hochdeutschen Komödianten, so the High German comedians as well. So they have their own traditions too. And it's not a case of like the English came and then they gave them the plays and then that was the end of that. It's more sort of fluid and more hybrid than that, because from the early 17th century, they were already shifting from English into German. And I think at that point, things do change. It's not the same play anymore. And it's not the same experience for a German audience either if they're finally able to watch these English plays in German. That makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does, absolutely. So we're not saying there is no theatrical culture in Germany until the English turn up, but it sounds like there's something distinctive about the way the English perform, which is pulling in these audiences. Okay, we must make this transition that you keep trying to make, and I keep stopping, and I'm sorry. So the Early Modern German Shakespeare project, and it's 4 translations and editions. Could you tell us more about your work there?
Yeah, well, I think Lucas Earn deserves all the credit for bringing the project together. And with the 4 plays that we translated and edited, 2 of them have already been published by Arden in this very handsome volume.
Wow, yes.
So here we have the German Hamlet and the German Romeo and Juliet, edited by Lucas Erne and Corinne Seidler. And they've done such a fantastic job, going through the texts and making them really accessible and really readable in modern English translation, with all the scholarly apparatus and the introduction, that digests a lot of scholarship, including a lot of very sort of difficult German language scholarship that a lot of people just simply wouldn't be able to engage with otherwise. So that's volume 1, Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet. Volume 2 will be out next year, and that will contain the German Tito Andronico, or Titus Andronicus, and a German version of Taming of the Shrew. So I worked with Lucas on the edition of Tito, and Florence Hazarat worked with Lucas on the edition of The Shrew. So overall, there's 4 sort of very different plays, different not only in terms of content, but also in terms of where the play texts have come from. So Tito was obviously a bit special because it was the play that I worked on, but it's also special because it's the earliest sort of Shakespeare play to be published in Germany. It was published in 1620 in a collection of English comedies and tragedies. And in fact, it's the first Shakespeare play to be published in a collection, because the folio doesn't come out until 1623. So again, the Germans are doing something even ahead of England at this time. So I don't know if you'd want to talk about any of the other plays, or just kind of listen to me ramble about Tito, which I think is a nice little example of the kinds of things that happen in these translations anyway. They're all very different. They all have their own sort of peculiarities. But as I was saying before, so Tito is the earliest, and it's published in print, right? And other texts that we dealt with on the project, I mean, Romeo and Juliet was a manuscript play that Corinne Seidler and Lucas edited. And I think it's from the late 1600s, that particular manuscript. But it's obviously based on a much, much earlier iteration of the play. And that's something that they discuss in a lot of detail in the introduction. So again, Hamlet, it's obviously based on a very early kind of performance that then sort of gets carried across the 17th century. But the text on which the translation is based, the earliest extant edition of it in German, again, is from the early 18th century, but it's clearly based on the performance manuscripts of the companies that performed that play. So again, there's these kind of layers of time and different sort of iterations and performances that you deal with when you work with text like this, because they're not straightforward and sort of, oh, hello, we've arrived, here's our edition, there you go. It's actually a lot more complex than that.
Yeah, thank you. And going all the way back to the original might be an unhelpful word there, but the early translations into Germany of these plays, it sounds like within these play scripts we have performance decisions, but also kind of early dialogue between English and German performers about these scripts. I'm not saying that we have that explicitly witnessed, but the textual decisions that are being made, the translation decisions being made within the German translations themselves, represent an early dialogue between these 2 different theatre cultures. I presume now you're opening all that up for us.
Yeah, well, it's always a series of negotiations, of what works in performance for these audiences. And I think that's why you just find this Tito Andronico kind of version of Shakespeare really interesting, because when you read it, it's essentially the same play. It's the same plot. It's recognizable as a Titus Andronicus play, but in other ways, it's just so different. And it kind of makes sense why it's different when you consider all the different kind of challenges that English players had to overcome to make the material in the play as we know it comprehensible for a German audience. So, for example, if you're thinking about translation and adaptation, it's very difficult to keep all the different verse elements of the plays. And so, for example, Tito is completely in prose. It's easy to do that, isn't it? When you're trying to mediate between different languages. And if maybe you've just learned German and, it's pretty basic, so you try to do as best you can when translating. So, for example, yeah, Tito's all in prose. There are other decisions that were made about the plot in order to streamline it. You know, what are the bare bones of the story that you need to make the play comprehensible? Then there's other elements that are really interesting, like when you adapt particular characters. So, for example, Aaron the Moor, you know, he's the kind of stock type of the black villain in Shakespeare's play. What happens to that kind of stock type when you try to adapt it under these kind of new conditions when you're a traveling company on the continent? So very often, excuse me, there's a change in characterization of particular characters. It's really interesting. And that's something that now that the German, early modern German Shakespeare project is finished, that's something that I'm still thinking about and I'd like to address in more detail, both in the English play, in the German play, and in a Dutch version of the material that also exists. I don't know if you'd want to hear more about the differences in how characters are portrayed.
Absolutely, yes, please.
Yeah. Also, one of the major things that I'm really interested in is, to begin with, the title of the play. So it's not just Tito Andronico, it's Tito Andronico and the Haughty Empress. So that's what the German play's title is in the volume in which it's published in 1620, which is interesting because the Haughty Empress is kind of depicted as a titular character, and indeed in the play, she is the principal antagonist, which is kind of true of Shakespeare's play as well. But there we also have Aaron the Moor, who is also a villain. You know, he perpetrates all kinds of villainies and outrages in the play, but that's not quite the case in the German play. It seems like the German version is emphasizing more the kind of immoral nature of the Tamara character, who's called Aetiopisa. It's emphasizing the fact that she is the bad person who is haughty and arrogant, who treats everyone very badly for no good reason whatsoever, because in streamlining the plot, they got rid of lots of elements of the English play that kind of make a lot of the conflicts make sense. But by stripping the play of all of those different elements, it just depicts Aetiopisa as being this really awful woman who precipitates all of the kind of awful, outrageous things like the rapes, the murders that happen in the play. Whereas the Moor character, who's called Morian from the German word for Moor, interestingly, he's not depicted in as negative a way as he is in the English play. But that's not to suggest that he doesn't have as important a function in the German play, because he absolutely does. He delivers over 25% of the spoken text, far more than any other character. So, you know, he's really kind of being played up for the audience, and he has these great big long speeches where he gives us lots of his backstory about how in his homeland he was the thunder and lightning champion of his country, that he was a military champion whose fame actually attracted the Romans to come and invade their country. And I should point out that the enemy faction in the German play is Ethiopian rather than Goth.
Huh.
So that's quite radical departure. So, you know, they're all kind of portrayed as being African, which again changes the function that Morian has, because, you know, he's not a Goth Moor, he is an African Moor, and Aetiopisa, his lover, his queen, is also an African queen. White. There's all of these different things going on in the play that seem to kind of make sense, but then also contradict each other. So that's, I think, one of the kind of major departures is the characterization of both the Tamara and the Aaron figure in the German play. They become rendered as kind of recognizable, but essentially not quite the same.
That's completely fascinating. If it's all right, I'm going to summarize some of the things you said just to get an overview of them. But I'm also wondering, we've been talking about a place called Germany through this film, but what we're really talking about are different German states within the Holy Roman Empire. And I wonder how, if you identify yourself as a citizen of the Holy Roman Empire, where you would put yourself in relation to Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus, which gives you Goths versus Rome. And we might be back to religious issues as well there, I guess. So I can see why this culture maybe might want to turn the Goths into Ethiopians. It sounds like the play is discovering new opportunities, fresh opportunities for racism and misogyny and the various decisions that are being made And you've talked about narrative decisions and changes in stereotypes and characterization. The addition of backstory in the case of the Aaron figure, and the elimination of not even backstory, but of justification within the space of the play in the case of the Queen, if I've understood you rightly, Maria. And I'm also wondering if some of these decisions might be also around the company putting on this play. Could this also tell us something about, you were talking earlier about the managing performer playing Pickle Herring. Might this also be something which is inflected by the importance of a character, of the actor playing the Tamara figure or the Aaron figure? I don't know.
That would just be complete speculation. There's not enough detail or enough records to suggest exactly what was going on. But the idea that they kind of adapted the background or the origin of the Goths and turned them into Ethiopians or Africans as a kind of way of making it a bit more appropriate and less offensive for a German audience. That's something that Jonathan Bate and Sonia Masai have proposed, that would kind of make sense in a Protestant German context. But they also, I think, suggest that changing the origin of the enemy faction sidesteps the issue of having the miscegenated baby as a central kind of problem of the play. And they imply that it's a fitting kind of moral cleansing of the play, but that's not actually kind of what happens, because the miscegenated baby is still there, because Tamara is white, Maureen is black, and their child has dark skin. So it doesn't really kind of solve that problem, because that is still in the play. Obviously, Maureen is a principal character. He's really important, and I think he's a sensational character, which is why he's given so much emphasis. You know, he's a bit cheeky. He acts as the go-between. You know, he's still kind of scheming when he needs to be scheming, but he also commands respect from the other characters too. So with the equivalent of Chiron and Demetrius, which are called Saphinus and Helicotes in the German play, you know, he kind of commands respect and he tells them what to do, and he kind of imposes his will and they listen. And I should also add too that there's a really interesting moment in the German play to do with the mixed race baby, which is quite a radical departure from the English play. So as people might know, in the English play, the mixed race baby is obviously evidence of Tamara's indiscretion with Aaron, and so the baby has to be gotten rid of. So Tamara is the one who says, you know, christen the baby with your dagger's point. So she wants to have the child murdered to kind of solve the problem of her indiscretion. But in the German play, that's not what happens. She asks the nurse to safely convey her dark-skinned child to Maureen so that he can take care of the baby and smuggle the baby out of Rome to his father's place, because apparently his father lives in the vicinity, so that the baby can be brought up in secret. So we've got this kind of, again, thinking about the backstory, we have Maureen's father who's going to take care of his grandson with this kind of diasporic community. And, you know, it's only a throwaway sort of reference in the play, but still it envisages a very different kind of future. The mixed race child in Rome is very different from the English play. And again, it's more positive, rather. It's not murder, it's preservation of the child's life in a familial network.
And presumably preservation of a child's life off stage and in the play's future, but still with an ending in which you have total wipeout of the central characters like you do in the Shakespeare play? Or, yeah.
You know, the child apparently is not harmed. It's promised that, you know, it'll be taken care of and it will be allowed to live.
Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you very much. So I should say for our viewers that underneath the film we're making here on the A Bit Lit website, there will be links to the first volume, which contains the German translations, well, the English translations of the German translations of Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet. And we look forward to your edition of Titus along with Shrew coming out into 2021, right? And we'll put a link on the website once it's out as well. Thank you very much. Maria, I've learned so much. I've been made to think about a period of playing that we so often think about just from the perspective of London, let alone of England, and instead to think about it from the perspective of Northern Europe. It's been really exciting to learn about how these texts travel through translation and indeed untranslated as well, and also to hear about how you yourself are navigating these worlds of editing, performance work, transnational and translation work. We end these films by asking the question, what the word literature means to you, and I'd be fascinated to hear this either from your own perspective or perhaps from the perspective of the people you work with. Who did the German audiences, what did they think they were watching, and did they think it was literature? But yeah, how does that word sit with you?
Yeah. I think in the context of this project and just generally, I think literature is a form of connection. It's a form of culture, connection to place, a connection to time as well. And I think for me personally as well, working on these plays has opened up so many perspectives that connect, my previous knowledge of early modern English drama, my previous knowledge of what it means to edit early modern drama, with all these new possibilities that are continually sort of challenging the ways that I work as an editor and as a scholar of literature. I don't know if that's a coherent answer, but
it's great. Yeah, connection to place, and also I think you've taught us in this film also a connection across different places as well. That we're really thinking about cross-place conversations. That's a terrible phrase, but thank you very much.
Conversation I'm going to carry on having, because in the process of creating, all the different sort of bits of research that went into the edition, you uncover so much material that you can't fully address in the introduction or in the notes. But it's so fascinating that I'm going to have to continue thinking through all the different documents that they don't get discussed. Sometimes there's an odd reference or an odd article in German that English readers, don't really engage with. And I think it's really time that people started thinking seriously about these kinds of plays. One very old critic from, I think, the 19th century described these adaptations, and they're not translations, they're adaptations, described them as monsters. They're not monsters, they're not the same as the English plays as we know them. They are adaptations, they're different, but they still have lots of value. They can do lots about textual and performance decisions, and they can also influence how we as editors think about Shakespeare's plays, and indeed plays by other playwrights in the period. So that's really the hope that this project will redress all of those discrepancies and help people to enjoy these plays as much as we've enjoyed them while working on them on the project.
Well, perhaps we can get you and/or the project team back sometime in the future to make some sequels exploring exactly that. It'd be lovely to hear more about that. But for now, Maria, thank you very much. It's been fascinating. Cheers.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for having me. Bye.